So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our latest in a series of these live virtual events from the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. Today's topic is trans data ethics. Three very loaded words that I'm sure we're going to unpack ad nauseum. So just so you know who I am, I'm Director of Finance and a Distinguished Fellow with CATS. I'm Avery Everhart, she, her pronouns. I'm an incoming assistant professor at University of British Columbia in geography. That's all you need to know. Otherwise, I'm moderating, so won't be talking very much myself except to pose questions and maybe do a little bit of synthesizing. But for the most part, I get to listen and nod very lovingly along to these three really brilliant human beings' contributions to my hurriedly posed questions. Rather than going around and doing super formal announcements of everybody's accolades, of which there are many, I'd rather have the participants spend a minute or two introducing themselves. And again, I've sort of asked them if maybe they want to share either major research projects recently or in the past that they might be known for or bringing here to think about, or the things that they're currently unpacking in their work, however you want to take that. And maybe I'll turn it to Stets first to introduce themselves.
Cool. Thank you so much for organizing. Thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here to chat with you all. I am Stats. I use they, them. I'm a junior fellow at the Center for Applied Trans Studies, and I'm also a grad student. And I'll be speaking from the perspective of psychology today. Not that we were brought here with like perspectives necessarily, but that is my field. So the major kinds of questions, I guess, and ideas that I think about in my work are perceptions of trans and gender diverse people in general, both from the perspective of in-group members, as well as from the perspective of people who are not trans or gender diverse themselves. I do a little bit of work thinking about development of trans kids. Particularly, I'm part of a larger group that looks at the trajectories of trans kids who were supported in their transitions from a young age. And then finally, I am also really interested in like the social policy element of this work, and I'm interested in the implications of like cisnormativity on the lives of trans and gender diverse people, and I'll leave it at that.
Amazing. Charlotte, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'll unmute myself. So I'm Charlotte Tate. I'm a professor of psychology at San Francisco State University. And some of you may know me from one of the first two-question methods to assess gender identity, cis and trans perspectives. Since then, a lot has happened. That was way back in 2012. So a lot has happened. A lot of people have taken it in different ways. And so I think we can touch on some of the good ways that it's happened. There are also some suboptimal ways. I'll try to be, charitable in my interpretations, but as you can see from all the hesitation there, I tend to also try to tell it like it is and be very direct. I don't mean that in a shade way, but in academia, precision is important. In the rest of life, I think just not wasting people's time is also important. So, so that's what I'll try to do as well. So, and I, parallel to kind of some of the stuff that Stats talked about, like I also am interested in lots of different psychological phenomena that are related to cis and trans and all the ways of meaning trans, including non-binary folks, to also talk about integrated models of how people have different kinds of gender experiences. So that's where I'll leave it. So that's me, and you'll hear more later.
Thank you, Charlotte. Last but not least, Zack.
Yay, this is very exciting. Thank you so much for organizing this event. I am an associate professor in community health sciences at the University of Calgary in Alberta, also known as Mohkinstsis with Calgary. And I love the question about major preoccupations. I guess I would say I'm really passionate about community-based research ethics and how how people engage with and understand research would be like an overarching question that I have. And I'm really interested in how we can use research ethics lenses to hold people accountable for the types of research that they carry out. So I have found that to be a useful lens for me, and I've tried to kind of think about things in that way. So yeah, that's probably my biggest preoccupation right now. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, y'all, for those really concise intros. I'm sure y'all have been to plenty of events where we academics tend to, go for twice the time. That was great. So then to build off of that and to give the audience and one another a bit more sort of personal perspective on how we came to this work, I'd love to hear from each of you how you ended up working on or with trans people or trans issues. And maybe especially if you came from a different realm, a different kind of work, if trans people, trans issues weren't your initial focus, then maybe what made you shift? Or if you've always been here and you're super like OG about it, then that's also a story we'd love to hear. Maybe I'll turn to Charlotte first.
I'm trying to practice my good Zoom behavior and mute myself each time I'm not talking, but the button seems to go everywhere. So in terms of, kind of how I started in working specifically on issues related to, to trans studies sort of in general, was in part because of personal experience, as a trans woman, and being in a psychology department, there was a lot of description from usually cis straight white men about what gender experiences were like. And they always struck me as abjectly incomplete and focused mostly on heteronormativity. So part of what I was really trying to do initially, way back in 2010, when I started really doing this work kind of heavily, was just trying to figure out basic answers to questions about psychological experiences of trans folks. So one of the first things we had to do and think about, which is where the two-question method came about, was, well, how do we ask people about their gender experiences in a manner that's both inclusive, respectful, and also helps us identify, folks who have, trans experiences, and folks who don't simultaneously, because one of my interests in psychological science is being able to measure things well and consistently, and be able to use that information to build theories about human behavior. So that's initially how we got into this work, and it was initially kind of trying to also expand the way that psychological literature very specifically thought about gender, which was collapsing everything to gender roles and gender ideologies and gender expectations that are all these fancy names within psychological science. But it all boils down to just basically how heterosexual cis people perform gender. And being a trans woman myself, knowing lots of other trans people, in my experience, there was so much more that psychological science just wasn't even paying attention to. That really started me to think, well, somebody's got to do this. And so I thought, well, I like getting into arguments with people in a good way. and so I can take that on. And that's basically what I've been doing in the past year since that time, is developing measurements of psychological experiences related to all of the different manners that we think about gender. So everything from gender self-categorization or identity, like the sense of like calling oneself man, woman, non-binary in any of the specific labels, but then also, as I already talked about, this idea of like gender roles, but how can we measure that better? How can we separate that from heterosexuality? Because I'm also a queer woman, I'm a lesbian with a capital L. So a lot of the gender roles for hetero women just don't apply to me. So I wanted to focus on measuring that. I also wanted to focus on measuring the displays, that people have in lots of ways, including clothing, mannerisms, and also attitudes that people have about their own group members, as well as people in other groups, gender-wise. So that, I think, and that's where I started, and it all came from, just to make it a little bit more concise, it came from a personal interest, and some of us in certain parts of academia, are sometimes told that me search, putting the me in research is not a good thing. But I also, am a trained scientist and have an avid interest in other sciences. And so part of what I also realized as well, you need observations in order to make good theories. Cis straight folks don't have the observations about what it's like to be trans. How are they, in any important way that we know how to do science, going to generate good, useful, and appropriate theories? The short answer is they're not. So what we need is to have people who have those experiences not just be sort of consulted and sort of left to the side, but to be fully integrated into and be principal investigators on these projects, because we know our experience is best. And then once we get a community of folks, we can start to, if we're in whatever disciplines, mine is science, other scholarship is totally acceptable and good as well. But we need to have people then be able to, who have those observations, to be able to talk about what those observations are and to develop theories that come from the folks who are having them. So that way we don't get misinterpreted, we don't get compacted into some experience that isn't ours, and we're not quite literally told what we're like by someone who really doesn't have a lot of insight into that. So that's, that's my journey, sort of, in hopefully accessibly and in miniature. So yeah, so I'll let another panelist describe that journey.
I'll stick with calling on people for now. Maybe we'll find a rhythm and we'll start volunteering a little bit more, but how about Zack next?
Thank you. And thank you, Charlotte. That was really, this is great. Also having this chance to hear from you and Stats. I'm also so intrigued by this question. So how did we come to, I have a maybe non-traditional career trajectory in the academic sense, because I worked in between my degrees and I actually never thought I would do a PhD. So I was just like, and I think, so I did a lot of work around sexual health, harm reduction, and reproductive health as well for many years. And I am also a social worker by training. So then I started working more in community mental health with 2S LGBTQ young people. And so it was through that work and this amazing project that I was so lucky to be involved with at the 519 in Toronto called the Trans Shelter Access Project that I started to get a lot more interested in community-based research. And so I feel like I came to this more through that CBPR lens and interests, which is probably evident, like as you start to do the work, you see where you always kind of go back to. So I came to it more that way. And I think it was partly my frustration that other people were always studying our communities, we'll just say broadly defined as like 2S LGBTQ communities, and that even if we were sort of like on a project as a, community member or from a community agency, we didn't always have like the control over the money, you know what I mean? We didn't always have a say in what was really happening. And I got really frustrated with it. So I was like, well, I was already teaching in community colleges and I was working, and I thought, maybe I'll go back and do a PhD, because I would actually like us to be able to center our experiences and have more of a say in that. And it seemed like it was always the people with the PhDs, you know what I mean, that were doing that. So that was really part of my motivation. I went back in my 40s to start my PhD, and it was a really great experience, especially when I figured out that I could actually do some work around trans research as a trans neurodiverse person. I was like, oh, this is kind of amazing. And I was really, again, very fortunate to end up in a department. It was Division of Community Health and Humanities at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And there was a group there that was focused on ethics, including healthcare ethics and research ethics. So I felt that I had a very supportive group of people around me to help me learn more about this part of it and this way of thinking about things. And then I think for me, I also realized I see research, like the documentation of it, all of the publications, as a proof of what researchers have been up to. And I really love thinking about it that way because I'm like, oh, well, they've written it all down and published it in journals, and it is there for us to look at and, use as a tool ourselves to see what they've been doing and what they've decided to pursue. So not only and when I say they, I mean, sort of outsider researchers. And especially I came to it with a real interest in the kind of what have the psychiatrists, the kind of medicalization, psychiatrization of our lives, like what have they been doing? So even though I have looked at research more broadly, I kind of tend to get really into that. And so, yeah, for my dissertation, I said, okay, how am I going to do this in a way that wouldn't be so immediately discreditable by, the cis folks out there, where we could sort of have something to stand on. And so I had learned about systematic review methods and evidence mapping, and just these ways that we can look very systematically at what's out there. And so I did, I admit I have become a little obsessed with those methods, but I don't use them in sort of like normal ways. I use them in a way where I'm like, oh, this is our like proof again of like what has been going on. And so that's the approach that I've taken in thinking about this research. I haven't tended to do as much research where I was like, talking with other trans, non-binary, and gender diverse folks. A few projects I have, but I've tended to be a bit more interested in the sort of secondary data of that's already been collected. And part of that for me was, under what conditions do we need to collect and have conversations and collect information together as our communities? When is it needed? And when do we also need to sort of look at what's already been there? Because that's a lot of our community's labor that went into those studies, whether it was with their consent or with our consent or not. So that's kind of where I have come to it from. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I guess that leaves me. In many ways, I think one thing that came to mind for me when I read this question is that I'm still kind of coming to work to like develop my work. So I guess I'm going to start at like a very concrete point, which is undergrad. So I went to a small liberal arts school where there were like 2 social psychology professors there. But the plus side of that meant that I got to do whatever I wanted. So I just like asked myself, okay, what am I interested in? And I was like, oh, I'm interested in perceptions of trans people. And so I did like a cute little one-off study about perceptions of cis people's perceptions of trans people. And I was like, okay, great. And I didn't realize that was weird at the time. I guess this was 2015, 2016. So I didn't realize there was anything like unusual about that. I was like, oh yeah, it's like, it's just social psychology. I'm just doing social psychology. And it really took me going to different places and different spaces and hearing what other people, again, I feel like this is like a common thread between the 3 of us, hearing what other people had to say outside of my like little small liberal arts bubble. And I just remember like being in spaces and rooms where people were just completely dismissing the experiences of gender diverse people and trans people. And I remember like there's so many funny little anecdotes, but I used to, when I told people like right after undergrad at a business school where I was working at the time that I wanted to study gender diversity, people were like, oh, you mean agentic women in the workplace? Yes, 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 very important. And I was like, that's not what I meant, but like, it's not something I could really talk back to. Or similarly, when I would ask, the grad students I was working with at the time, if I could add like, just like, non-binary, like man, woman, non-binary as like a third option of gender identity, people would tell me, oh, that will just make error variance. Like we can't, like, well, either it'll be error variance, or we'll just have to throw those participants out anyway. And I was like, oh my goodness, what, like, is this really how the field that I'm thinking about going into as, a gender diverse person thinks of us. And so that's really what motivated me to come back to my original interest in studying the experiences and perceptions of gender diverse people. And I'll leave it at that. And by and large, I think I'm still coming to figure out what it is that I'm working on. So check back in 10 years. Maybe I'll have a more well-rounded story.
It's already well-rounded, and it will continue to expand and get ever more round as you polish it. It's going to be great. And thank you all for, of course, for sharing more about how you ended up in this kind of work. And I want to pick up, maybe as a way to segue, one of the last things that you said, Stats, about, well, if we throw on a third, gender option is just going to end up censored. So really the first substantive question that I had prepped for us to discuss is kind of in that vein. And it's about, from your perspective, what we think trans people, maybe who aren't researchers, what they think about data, how they view data, what their perspectives are, if it's maybe different from those of us who are researchers who do have to work with data, as well as maybe experiences that you've had in doing research with trans people or on trans populations more generally. So I guess to sort of alchemize that together, we can say what maybe attitudes, and I'm aware that I'm talking to psychologists and mental health people. So I know attitude, perception, these things mean very specific things to you. Also feel free to correct me. That's not my training. But what attitudes toward research or data, statistics have you run into in your work with trans communities? And maybe what are some of those experiences in doing that work that you'd really like to highlight, either as, especially instructive for us as folks who are interested in this work, or maybe as something that was especially instructive for you and your process? Give you a minute to mull it over, and then anybody that wants to start is welcome to.
All right, well, I guess I can start. And I'll give it one of the historical experiences that I had. So when we first started doing this work in 2010, me and my lab, that is, I've, at the time, I had a grad student who's now a professor. It's non-binary, and myself, as a trans woman, and we were, embarking on one of our first projects. And one of the specific reactions that we got in even trying to sort of look for places to recruit folks was a resistance to psychology, because we're in a psychology department. And it took me a minute, because I had to, I generally don't pay attention to the hegemonic structures of the world in part. I have to, so that I understand what they're doing poorly. But I just didn't understand how, especially in 2010, how deeply held, purposefully and appropriately, attitudes were about psychology specifically. And to a bit of a point that Zack brought up, this idea of psychiatry, the psychologizing of trans experience as somehow other, somehow abnormal, somehow just sort of set apart. And as researchers in psychology, it was difficult initially for us to understand how to work with that perception, because it was just thought that Jay and I were just these uninformed psychological researchers who just wanted to take from trans experience. So it really got Jay and I to think together and then separately about the care with which we actually recruit trans folks into samples, and really trying to message, which is something that is not easily taught and consistently taught in psychological science, but to actually take your participants not as these kind of subjects or objects in the world that you have to sort of find and corral, which is the major perception. You just sort of throw something up on a research platform, and then data are collected, and you're very dispassionate about how you do it. That's the cis hetero white man way of doing it. But we realized that what we had to do was actually engage in how we communicated what our study was about. We had to write preambles to basically address the fact that, yes, psychology has a historically terrible mean, I'll swear on this thing because I'm from the Midwest and we swear casually, but it's totally a totally fucked up history relative to trans experience. And of course, Jay and I, as trans folks ourselves, were not part of that, but we also had the appropriate awakening that we represent an institution by virtue of being part of a department of psychology. And so what we really wanted to do was make sure that we were able to communicate. We are not apologizing, and we're not apologists for how fucked up psychology was in the past. That's on them. And for those of you who know me professionally, I still go to the American Psychological Association meetings and call them out for all of their bad behavior, including, the 73-year odyssey to take homosexuality out of the DSM. So that history can't be recovered, and nor am I, as someone who's part of that field, going to apologize about it on behalf of the bad actors. But what I can do, and what I have done since then, is made sure that people understand that research about trans folks from the perspective of trans researchers is necessary to correct some of the wrongs that have happened in the past. And one of the main issues that I talk to people about, because I'm often asked, with activists to kind of be on panels with them, and I tell people the activism I do as a research scientist is not kind of out in the streets. The activism I do is to clean up all the bullshit that already exists in the psychological literature specifically, but then all the literatures that use psychology as their basis. And that's, I think, the way to both do good science, because none of that was good science in the past. White men sitting in armchairs, imagining what it's like to have, an experience completely separate from theirs, and then saying, no, this is good enough, whatever the conclusions were. And that's calling out Robert Stoller, all the other people in psychology and psychiatry. Like that way of being and that way of doing things just needed to stop. And it's, unfortunately, some of it is still with us. But that thinking that Stoller and others put down still is the touchstone for how not only other scientists in psychology understand what's happening, but also how the public understands what psychology may or may not be doing. And so as a researcher, I need to be out there and I need to say, I'm trying to correct the record. I also have to, as an appropriate connection of this, take the perspective of folks who say, no, I don't believe you, or psychology is unrecoverable as a field. And that's fine. Like I'm not going to apologize for the field. I'm trying to create a new regime of how psychology research is done. But we'll always have to have and acknowledge the problematic past behavior of that field. And so I think in terms of data, one of the important things that we need to be able to do is make sure that we communicate the reason that we're collecting data and the perspective that we as researchers have. So the main point is to be able to engage trans communities writ large with this idea that, yes, people have behaved poorly, that, and in the past and currently, there is no way to deny any of that. And this research team is trying not to do that. And I think we need to be able to create that perspective, not just from individual research teams, but really educate folks who are trying to do that research, that if they don't have that perspective, if they're just trying to, Columbus, something like I figured something out about trans issues, or, I'm a cis person who wants to hug all the trans babies. Like, no, like that perspective should not exist now. It should have never existed in the past. We need to do right by the communities, because our ethical responsibility, especially in collecting data about humans writ large, is to understand and respect the autonomy of the humans, and to make sure that the humans understand why we're collecting data, and then on our own side to actually do it well and be accurate in what we say. And we're not able to understand the accuracy if, instead of focusing on the history, the situatedness, the context, we instead focus on our own careers, our own inflated egos, our own narcissistic tendencies as fields. I mean, I've been a professor for a long time. There are a lot of narcissists in our field. I tend not to have professors as friends on purpose because of that. So, I want people to understand, in general, that the approach that we need to take is one of concerted care. We need to really take seriously the fact that the past, especially related to trans research and ideas about trans people, has been completely fucked up and is mostly unrecoverable. So we need to just make a shift and start over. And I think we need to get that kind of message out there to all researchers, irrespective of whether the researchers themselves are trans. So that's what I'll start out saying, and I'll let someone else pick up and talk about what they do.
Yeah, as a fellow person in psychology, also, working in the trans and gender diverse space, I can definitely, a lot of what you said resonated with me, and it was, just put so eloquently in this crucial part of the conversation to understand and to bring people into a basic awareness of when they're entering a space with trans and gender diverse folks, they are not up against, but they speak not only for themselves, but for the history of their field. When I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about maybe some things that I've encountered, some conversations I've had with people a little bit more recently, and just observations that I've taken away from it. So I guess the first thing I've noticed is that sometimes there's this, as more research and more ethical research has been done with and by trans communities about trans and gender diverse people, I feel like sometimes there's a mismatch between the community's understanding of what research can or cannot do for them and what we as researchers are willing to say based on data that we collect. So I know that I've been in spaces where people feel like research can either prove one's identity or disprove one's identity, and that is at least for me, that is never the place that I come as a researcher. That's never my goal. It is simply collecting data and making observations about that data. I would never say any of my research would prove that someone is or is not a gender that they say they are, for instance. So people look at research for validation in a way that sometimes I cannot provide. And so that's something that I've come up against. Another thing that I've come up against is that trans and gender diverse folks are not a monolith. I mean, we all know that sitting in this room, but I think that when I'm thinking about even what you were just talking about, Charlotte, this ethical versus unethical, sometimes it's not so clear, because what one person desperately wants you to do, another person is oh, you definitely shouldn't do that because that will harm the community. And that is just, I don't think I can think of any research topic that's uncontested. At least none come to mind for me. And so in a way, it is not possible to do no harm in a way, because I think that to some extent, no matter what I do, someone is going to feel hurt by it. And that is a I guess, tough reality as a researcher, at least for myself, to realize that I want to go out there and be positively representative of both research and of my community. But at the end of the day, we will all be doing our best, and still someone will feel hurt, and we have to validate that, kind of like what you were saying. And then I guess the last thing that I've noticed that is frustrating for me is that the research that has the fewest researcher degrees of freedom, another way of putting it is the research that is most representative of trans voices is often considered the least rigorous in psychology. So qualitative methods. People we're talking about data here, and I think a lot of psychologists if you get a bunch of psychologists in a room, when you say data, psychologists think numbers. And so we are in this position where we're taking people's lived experiences and turning it into numbers and then making conclusions. Whereas in spaces where we, take people's lived experiences and maybe take a more qualitative approach, coding it, so on and so forth, it doesn't go as far in the field of psychology. So that's something that, especially as a student, I've been, just thinking about and keeping in mind. And honestly, am a little bit frustrated with. So anyway, I'm going to pass it along to Zack.
Thank you. I was thinking about this question too in relation to what type of responses I've heard or what I've heard people looking for, you know what I mean? Community members who might not be so-called researchers. And I guess part of my bias is I always think of research as being useful, that it should be useful in some way. I know that that is maybe a bit odd for some people, but I've had sometimes when I'm teaching like research methods, I've had people say like, well, does it always have to be useful? And I'm always like, what do you mean? Like, yeah, of course, but of course it doesn't. But that's definitely my bias, is that research should be useful. And in particular, when I think about our communities, I feel like yes, the research needs to be useful to us in some way. So I've been super intrigued, and I've been trying to pay more attention to, in the current situation we're in, where there's so much like anti-trans hate, and so much in the media against us. I've been intrigued to see then how sort of people who are trans and non-binary take up research in relation to, say, dis and misinformation. So if we see, like, I was so fascinated because, you do your research and you publish it in the journals and other places, but you publish it in the journals because that's part of what we are supposed to do. And then you just hope that people will read it, right? And you don't want to talk about it. So I was like, kept, every once in a while look at, is anyone paying attention to, that the trans research evidence map, that I worked for gazillion years on with other people too. And then I was like, there's this thing called altmetrics. Sometimes I'm a little slow, to catch up to things, but I was like, altmetrics, yes, what is that all about? So I started looking and I was like, oh my gosh, people are actually like citing my paper, but not like academics. The general, the community members are using it. And so then I became like a little bit obsessed with seeing what's happening on social media. I'll say Twitter for now, as that has been sort of like the most dominant, I think, place where I have seen, and probably also where it's being tracked. But people will put links into the evidence map in response to transphobic comments from folks, and they'll say, you think we don't exist? Here's 600 studies that say we do, and then link. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? So for me, I'm really intrigued by this use of our work and the way it does potentially get taken up. Because if we look at like the stats just for that paper, I think it's like 80%, it says, are members of the public, broadly defined, right? So that's kind of fascinating to me, and I love it. And so then I just want to know, okay, what else would be useful? What other information would be useful in this current scenario to help move forward the work that we're trying to do, and to resist this really hateful, these really hateful movements, right? So for me, that's something that I'm really intrigued by. And I think the other thing that will happen to me is people will ask me, or I'll see on like message boards, like, what does research say about blank? If I take hormones and I am neurodiverse, like, what are the potential positive or negative implications? Where can I find that information? How do I understand it? And so I find that's another type of question that I hear more often. That's just like practical, right? People just want to know, what do we know about this? And if we don't know, can we find out? So that's sort of where I guess I'm coming to it from.
Thank y'all. This is already so wonderful. I'm gonna do two little like housekeeping things that I forgot about. We have a legacy that we're building at CATS where we often have open chat. So for panelists, I will monitor that. Please don't let yourself get distracted by this filling up, but I realized it was turned off. So it should be on now, because folks have been using the Q&A to sort of react to things as well. So I will end up dismissing those so that we can save the Q&A function for specific questions. So there's at least one that will get answered, but a lot of the others are like, love the use of Columbus as a verb, or like snaps and claps. So that y'all can communicate with each other. Hopefully the chat will be on now. But I feel like we've kind of already maybe anticipated some of the places that I was going to go next, in thinking a lot about how data can harm, or this history in, especially, we could say psychology, we could say the medical sciences, we could say a bunch of different fields where in the name of scientific research, people have been enabled and empowered to harm our communities. So I'm going to go a little off script because I think it's bringing up something that now I'm noticing is like a gap in some of the questions I prepared. And this is something that I'm personally really invested in as somebody who publishes open access pretty frequently, like whenever there's funding, there's always the funding issue, including open access in like a feminist philosophy journal, the same as a spatial epidemiology journal, because I want everybody to be able to access it. But with that, I feel like comes this sort of catch-22 that I think we've begun to approach of like how the work that we do gets used in excess of our intentions for it. And how that's also probably true of any kind of academic or scientific research. But I'm especially interested in like in this context that Zack, you're kind of pointing us to, and this legacy that you really highlighted for us, and especially in psychology, Charlotte, and for maybe myself as somebody closer to stats in terms of like being junior scholar, emerging, what can we do? Or should we be trying to, I guess, anticipate the ways that our work will get taken up, either by the public, positive or negative? And what are maybe some strategies that we could think of for how to, maybe to your point, Charlotte, about with recruitment, how could we also sort of plan for communication of the work in a way that means we're trying to make it more accessible to the public. We want people to be able to use it. We hope that it can be used to combat, you know, anti-trans legislation or things like that, because they love to pull from pseudoscientific literature. But what can we actually do, or maybe what have y'all with this experience done in the past, or maybe we can strategize together about how to sort of anticipate the ways our work might get taken up. Sorry for going off script, but now I'm like, ooh, I have the captive audience of 3 very smart people, so I'm posing the question.
Anyone else want to go first? I feel like we were talking about patterns, just that people are aware before this, and I feel like I'm gonna start answering every question first. But but in this case, I will. I think, to me, Avery, thank you so much, because I think this question I've been dealing with in different ways for the past 15 years of thinking about, and to me, I think there are 2 goals that don't have to be competing, but often are. And the one goal is all of us as scholars, no matter what the scholarship is, if we're professional scholars, we need to communicate with the scholarly literature, whatever that looks like for us. And the way by which we do that is to use a lot of jargon to talk about specific ideas, thoughts, studies, whatever that were in a line. And that is not what anyone in the public can really easily get. The public is, of course, extremely smart, but they're inexperienced tracking a very specific set of argumentation without the context. And so but that's what we need to do as scholars. Part of, I think, at least myself, I'll speak, but I would imagine many more people, we got into the scholarship because on some level we appreciate that. As fucked up as I think psychology has been historically, there's something awesome about seeing patterns of human behavior, and I want to do that. And I want to talk to people about that. And I do, and nicely for me, I get to do that in a variety of ways, and some of those are my professional publications. But I think one of that other goal of trying then to get people to understand it, it's taken me a while to realize that the goals compete in part because we don't have, and I'll try to say it sort of carefully, we have a smart public who's not trained about what science, in my case, actually is. And they're not trained about what other kinds of scholarship actually are. And not necessarily for any bad reason, but that's just the reality of the situation. So I think one of the solutions that I have talked with my other colleagues about is really trying to do work that translates your scholarly information into something like a blog or into something like whatever like folks are interested in, but just like it tries to unpack it being the scholarship and make it more accessible, kind of and tell people what is interesting about it. And I think we also, some of us as scholars, sometimes see the silly version of that, which is like, buy my book. and it's all just sort of rolled into like, I'm going to run around and be a talking head, and it's all about me and capitalism and my relationship to capitalism. And it doesn't need to be that. But I think, to me at least, this idea of trying to actually, and it can be take every particular work that you've done, like scholarly work, and translate it into more accessible language, or just trying to do summaries of kind of the field, like here's kind of where we are. But the important piece about all of this is to remember the perspective that the public has, which is they're not following the arguments that have historically happened. I tell my students this all the time, like, we're trained to speak very precisely, in a very particular conversation space. And that's not what most people are able to do. And again, not because they're not smart, because they haven't been trained 6-7 years or more in how to do that. So it's really about making sure that the topic that you're kind of describing, or the findings, if it's a scientific finding, or the themes, whatever scholarship means to the individual scholar, it's really kind of like a state of the not only the field that you're in, but also how can someone access it. You really have to turn to the idea of, if you were a smart person but you didn't know that psychology has been fighting with itself for 50 years about X, how would you boil that down to someone as a starting point, and then allow those individuals to really understand some of the key things without jumping into the jargon? Because I think that's unfortunately a little bit of what I see, especially on the social media platforms. I'll see researchers jump in and be like, go read this article. But I mean, think about that. Like, I have difficulty reading Foucault, not because I'm not smart, because I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, who is Foucault talking to? What is he talking about? I'm not trained to read Foucault. So you can't just go tell me to read Foucault, in the same way that I can't just tell someone in the public, like, go read a multivariate statistics article that I've written about trans issues. Like, no, that's setting people up for not being able to not only get it, but then it sets up certain kinds of misinterpretations, because folks just don't have the experience. So we've got to be those translators, and to say what is accurate about what happened, but also to really say it in a manner that is the most accessible to the most people. And of course, the caveat to all of that will be that some people still will deny it. Unfortunately, Fox News will still exist, and sources of misinformation that are siloed will still exist. So we can't do anything about that, and nor do I think we should really try to spend most of our time trying to intervene. There's a separate issue about how we, I think, can engage with that. But in terms of being able to make that translation of our own research, which, by the way, is also not going to be easy. It also takes more time as a scholar to break out of that scholarly situation. And the final point I'll make is that, and also, unfortunately, a lot of us as professional scholars, as academics specifically, a lot of our friends are academics. So we also get a false picture of what people really are talking about and what they're really understanding. And if we try to use that then to even write our blogs or write our books, we're also going to set ourselves up for a certain kind of failure, because we're not speaking as generally as we could. So, so my practical advice is, if you're a professional academic, get friends outside of academia and listen to them when they talk to you, because you will understand, this is how I need to communicate, so that the point that I'm making is made, but I don't lose people. I don't have their eyes glaze over. I don't have people just say, yeah, that's cool, but no one wants to analyze it that specifically. Like, I think lots of people have an interest in a topic, but that really we're using our experience and almost, in a certain sense, foisting it onto other people. Like, think like I think, speak like I speak, when we should say, let's all try to have a conversation. So yeah, I'll pass it to Zack just to break it up, the pattern.
Great, thank you. I'm absolutely in agreement, and I think we need sort of like multiple channels, because I think, and this goes back to what Avery said too about open access and access to information. Like, I think that we should really have, I'm trying to build this portal, a searchable portal for research about trans and non-binary folks, right? And one of the values I had in relation to this with my team was, let's include everything in there, and then people, like, let's not censor it and say, well, this is crap, you know what I mean, like, don't read this, it's terrible. But instead, like, let's be as transparent and open with the information that is there, and then help people like answer people's questions, you know what I mean, if they're like, I don't understand this, or, you know, can we write then accessible summaries, or can we find ways to do that has both? Because what I also hear from, you know, I work with the Families in Transition program as part of the program evaluation team, and the clinicians that work with that group say parents come here with research articles, you know, and they want to know, or they're using this to say, see, this is the problem, or, you know, so maybe I think part of our responsibility is to make the work more accessible, but also to help people understand the results that are there in these, you know, in these articles and reports, et cetera. So I think both is great, and also just having it be accessible and findable, because so often people don't know where to look, right? So then they end up on, you know, on a website maybe that has really all the anti-trans, you know, quote unquote information, you know. So I think the more we can build that, I think, to me, that's a priority from my perspective. Yeah. I don't know, Stats, if you want to comment on these too.
Absolutely, yeah. I think knowing your audience and accessibility are two like key parts, like steps towards answering this question. I will say that when I heard your question, Avery, I think I took it in like maybe a slightly different direction. Story of my life. But I was kind of thinking like, oh, how do we protect, you know, trans folks and like the people we work with? And I was thinking like the thing that came top of mind to me was actually like, okay, number one is you have to protect the identity of the people that you're working with. Like, so to give a great example, like this isn't stuff that I do in my own personal work, but the stuff that the lab that I'm a part of does more broadly. Like I think I mentioned earlier that we work with trans kids who were supported in their identities from a young age. And so a huge part of that work is to make sure that these people are forever anonymous. Like no one's ever going to be able to track these people down. Like I know that at least in psychology, there's like a big push towards like open data, open as much as you can, be open with everything. And that is something that we can't do, or we can only do to like a very limited extent in order to protect the identities of the people that we work with. So that was the first thing that came to mind. And then I guess another thing that came to mind was to be, I guess, I don't know, the way I think of it is being like as impenetrable as possible when it comes to analyzing your data. So for folks who work with quantitative data, there's always, 50 different ways to analyze your numbers, and you can draw different conclusions depending sometimes on what analyses you run. And so one thing that I've noticed that a bunch of the papers that come out of this lab do is we analyze our data in multiple ways, so other people can do that for us. So if, for instance, we have like a main question that we're interested in, we'll take our data and analyze it in like 5 different ways to like try to answer the same question essentially. And so in a sense, we are trying to anticipate the critiques of the people who are going to see our article and be like, oh, like this is, and just debunk it by telling us that we like maybe didn't use the right method or analysis approach. And so at least like even if the results change or something, like we will know that in advance. And so it's not like a surprise to us when it gets back around to us. And then we can address it explicitly or not, depending on, what the topic is in the article that we write. So kind of trying to like make it a little bit more impenetrable from like the academics side, because, and I guess to that end, I guess I would say like there are, regardless of whether or not we do this work, there will be other people who have maybe not quite as good intentions doing the work. So like keep doing the work. It's so important for people like all of us in this room, to keep doing what we're doing, even if it is imperfect at some times. And going back to Charlotte's point, like Fox News is never going to shut down. Like often people will take the exact same fact, and no matter, I'll give a very concrete example. So the idea of like access to gender affirming healthcare, there's an argument that has been around for a long time that if people, if young children, I'm coming from a developmental perspective, if young children don't continue to identify as trans in the long term, you shouldn't have gender affirming healthcare because it's pointless, or whatever term people want to use out there. But then on the flip side, there's now a new argument that if we give people access to gender affirming healthcare, they're going to continue to identify as trans, and also that's a problem. So sometimes it's just like, it's a catch-22, you can't get out of it, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing the work. And I think that's all I had to say. Yeah, cool.
Thank you, especially for indulging me on posting a question I didn't fully prepare you for. But I want to pick up a couple of those threads as a way of posing one I did give you in advance. So for me, this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot lately that I think is kind of related. And because it was most recent, I'll pick up on the thing that you were saying, Stats, about like, well, maybe one of the worst things we could try to do possibly, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, is like anticipate the Fox News of the world that are going to necessarily try to either manipulate or recontextualize or misinterpret or say, well, if this, then that, because they don't care about contradicting themselves. So this question is kind of about our work as folks based in the US and Canada in particular, and Canada and the US are very different, especially in terms of their legislative context right now. But still, I feel like there's this way that I've been noticing that I know each of us have probably been thinking about in different ways, that the sort of geopolitical, the socio-legal context in which the work we do is happening really structures the way we can interpret it. And that's not a critique so much as it is like a recognition that every perspective is limited. And as a geographer, it's something I think about quite a lot as well, as like, so if so much of the work that we rely on, especially to make arguments in favor of gender affirming care for youth, or to argue for legal protections or access to something like documentation change, that it's coming from, especially those of us in the US, a context where we have a very variable and to certain degrees in some places extremely repressive, and in other places a lot more affirming legislative context. And so I'm curious about maybe the transnational or the global interplay of how our work based in the global north, especially Anglophone global north, really influences the scientific literature overall. Maybe what that has to do with how we come to think of transgender as a global category, but a fraught one. And any thoughts you might have about potentially like an ethical path forward that looks like being in solidarity with other researchers, with others and their social movements in places that have totally different like systems that are, you know, interplaying in these ways that shape our work, where their context might look really different. And I will put the prepared question in the chat as well, because I posed it a little differently. So if you need to like revisit, because I rambled. And maybe we can wait a second for Stats for you to come up with a thought or something, so I can have you go first just to break up our pattern.
For sure. I will say this is the one question that was like way out of my like scope of knowledge as someone who studies trans and gender diverse folks in the US primarily. So I think I'm going to keep it short and see what other people have to say, and then see if like maybe that sparks something for me. But I guess in my mind, what you were talking about is like an instantiation of like this kind of like common problem in psychology, where we like take ideas and theories that we developed by looking at like US college students for the most part, and go out and try to elicit the same kinds of findings in other parts of the world in like a not culturally responsive way. Just kind of like, we take what we think we know and just do the exact same thing in a completely different context and expect it to replicate. And more often than not, that's not the case. I think one of the most fundamental issues, I guess, in my mind, is that we're not necessarily even talking about the same groups of people in different parts of the world. And like, I know that there's like, for instance, like based on conversations I've had with experts in other parts of the world who are not me, like there's an extreme conflation between working the idea of trans and intersex in some places in the world. And so we're talking about completely different sets of people, where if you brought these people, if you had a conversation with these people and gave them the Western US, UK definition of trans, they would be like, oh, that's not me. And so we're equating across groups of people that wouldn't necessarily identify that way themselves. And I think, at least for me, part of the drive that I see in the field of psychology to do this is this interest that our field has in like mapping human universals, like things that are true of all humans. And it's, at least in some spaces that I've been in, it's kind of held up as the gold standard of like, if you can say something about a human universal, like a universal of human behavior, then you're going to get like, you know, the next like MacArthur Award or Nobel Prize or whatever. And I think that, but I think that it's equally important to value what makes each group different and unique. So I don't necessarily agree with, like, that is not my goal as like a burgeoning researcher. But I'm really curious to hear what both of you have to say about this, and maybe I'll think of something else along the way.
Do you want me to go, Charlotte? Okay. I also feel I wrestled with this question, absolutely, but I think it's such an important question in that I feel, you know, I think we're getting better at reflecting on our own, you know, positionality and, you know, the privilege that we have in our, you know, situations like that I have, right? So I guess the way I approach this question is more about where are the resources and where are the opportunities for people to be able to share more of perspectives from, like, you know, global South? Where are the opportunities to have conversations, and how can we act in solidarity together? That's where I was sort of coming to it from, because even if you think about it as it's partly knowledge hierarchies, it's partly where information is shared, it's even the, you know, English Anglo dominance, right, of publications. And so even if you, like, say in my work of trying to do evidence maps or systematic scoping reviews, a lot of times you'll look and they'll only look at things that are indexed in certain databases or published in English, you know, so automatically you're just discounting, you know, in entire areas of knowledge, work, and experience. So I think that's one part of it. But the other part for me is definitely about material resources, funding for projects, funding to be able to have dialogues, bring people together. I think that's really key. I thought, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, you know, there could be a CAT's Big Ideas panel that addresses this exact question? You know, like, I thought that would be really amazing, because what are we doing to learn, you know, and hear each other's voices? So yeah, and then I went to a place around the financial piece. Like, I was sort of intrigued. Earlier this year, the Sonar Foundation brought out this call where they were investing 1.5 million in this Trans Impact Challenge, but it was kind of intriguing because they really prioritized community-based, community-led, you know, small initiatives. They didn't seem to even want to hear from, you know what I mean, big established organizations. They're like, oh, you can arrange to, you know, flow the money through a third-party organization. So showing that they really were interested in the grassroots piece, and they consulted with community members from trans and non-binary communities to really including, like, the intersections of people's experiences and, you know, racialized and indigenous trans and non-binary communities to identify those priorities. So I guess that's another thing I think about. Well, if you want to do something differently, do it differently. You know what I mean? Fund different things, center voices of who have not been centered to date. So yeah, that's kind of how I would approach it. It was my decision.
Yeah, and thank you both for the comments. And I think I'll just sort of think about the question and answer it a little bit from, like, the sort of personal professional paths that we have, because I have thought a lot about this in different ways. And I think on the one hand, the larger sort of geopolitical context is something that, as I think both previous speakers have said, we need to be aware of, but we as a set of scholars specifically, and I can speak most particularly for psychology because in some ways we're sort of like the farthest behind like the social sciences as such, and in part on purpose because of the way that psychology wants to think about itself more like a natural science, to Statz's point. But nonetheless, I think that kind of issue of how we actually create a global context, we're still learning how to do in lots of ways, and we're still learning how capitalism screws it up, and and there's all the existing hegemonic post-colonial history of colonialism, all of that gets in there. So I don't know that we'll be able to answer that sort of easily. And Zach, I hear you. Like that's a whole set of CATS panel, big ideas for for many years to come on purpose. And I want people to hear that. Like that's a real issue. What can we do sort of in our own work is kind of how I'll specify it. And what is part of it is to make the point that in your own work you recognize that. And we tried to do this way back in the first 2-question article that we had in 2013, where we said this method that we're developing and the response options that we have is for the US specifically. And we even named, like, in different European countries, these might sound slightly different, and especially in the global South, other places. What we were trying to do, it didn't seem to have much impact, as many very academic papers don't, is really empower researchers to do it themselves. Use our structure, use our form, but put your information in it. And another way that we talked about that, and what I try to do very intentionally now, is write in my title in the United States, to write in my abstract in the United States, to remind people this isn't to Stats this sort of point about how psychology wants to think about itself. This is not the universal human. This is in the United States, and when it's relevant, with mostly white samples, because within the United States we also have to think about the diversity of race, ethnicity, and and other experiential categories, and how that works. But to do that, and it may seem like a small thing, but but notice the other side, because I'm an editor now for a journal. And what we're always getting is people saying, like, in Nigeria, in these places, and I don't want them to have to be like, we have to name our country, but the US and Europe and Canada and Mexico don't have to. No, we have to as well. And we need to do that in the beginning and remind people in our intro, in our discussion for writing scholarly work, that this is what we've done here. And empower people that way. Take it and make it your own. And when you get into positions like me, as an associate editor or an editor-in-chief or as a reviewer of scholarly papers, hold people accountable. Make them put that in there. Like that can be part of your review if you're a reviewer, is to say, like, you talked about this in the US. Put that in your damn paper, and somewhere prominent in the abstract, in the title. Don't allow people to think that this is the model, and then people have to talk about how their socio-political, geocultural context is different than the unnamed norm. That kind of thinking just should have died a long time ago. With human behavior, it's still here, unfortunately, but that's the work I think we can do, and that's going to help allow people in different cultural contexts to really start naming things, and then to be able to have that interplay to say, this group found something in the US. That's awesome. Let me tell you about this other, geo-national context. And that way we can start to form an understanding that is more horizontal than vertical. But it's on us in these contexts, whatever our own specific, racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, demographics. We may think, and it may be true, that in this culture we may have less social privilege. But when we send our papers to the global South, they don't know those things about us. They see United States of American, they see European, they see Canadian, they see it as that. So we need to take responsibility and accountability and help uplift people by using that tool to say, and it's just our context. We're just one of many.
Thank you again for such really generative answers, and I'm loving the conversation. And for the sake of time, I may skip us to the end. I feel a little bit like Pee Wee Herman, like you said the secret word, because the last question is based off of a discussion we kind of had leading up to the event on our end about accountability. So as we're wrapping up, folks here, please do feel free to pose your questions in the Q&A because we're going to guard some time after this for those. So if you end up with them in the chat, we may not see them, but if you put them formally in the Q&A, we will. But so as we're wrapping up the really prepared portion of today's event, I think it's a great time to think together about what accountability might actually look like at this nexus of research, of transgender lives as they're led, of data, both qualitative and quantitative, and I would add spatial as our resident geographer, one of several at CATS, by the way. Maybe we can think both at a sort of intra-community level, like among or within trans communities, but also as well holding others outside of our communities accountable to trans community priorities as they emanate from the people that are living these lives. So I guess to turn it into the question, I'll ask, what mechanisms for accountability might we be able to construct or even imagine? We don't have to go as concrete as construct just yet. And how can we maintain lines of communication or build new ones within our communities to do that accountability work? And maybe as a third bonus part, how can people who might be invested in our communities but don't share our experiences or identities be already or become accountable to trans people and to trans community? And I'll copy that one in the chat as well, so you can like, because as soon as you add a third part to a question, it's when everybody's like, and I lost it. Clears the cache.
This is a huge question now. It became massive. Is it good if I start? I'll start this one. Okay. I'm super passionate about the accountability piece and how we can be doing more to hold researchers accountable, including researchers in our communities, but often I think more about outside. I think that because of my own passion around research ethics, I keep thinking about that piece in terms of, sometimes I'm sure many of you have wondered, how the heck did that ever get approved? You know what I mean? Who was on that? Well, did it get approved? Maybe that's the first question, because there's a whole bunch of research going on that doesn't, especially in the clinics, right? That does not go through REB because it's seen as health admin data. And I have a major problem with that. And I do believe that needs to change. So that's one piece, but that's not even going to REB. So that's a problem we have. And there are many complicated dynamics in the clinics. So that's one piece. But I do think we should address health admin data as one aspect of this. But I also think, when research related to trans and non-binary folks is going to these research ethics boards or the IRBs, in the States, you call it IRB, in Canada, we call it REB. But what is happening? Is there anybody there that knows anything about our fields of research, about, the questions to ask, what's even just on sort of like general demographic questions that are in so many surveys? What guidance have the REB members been given, and where are we in terms of this piece? And I admit I've been so grateful to learn from some of our Indigenous colleagues around the work that has been done to develop guidelines like the First Nations principles of OCAP, which OCAP being ownership, control, access, and possession. And in Canada, we also have, for our Tri-Council ethics guidelines, there's a chapter that specifically relates to research with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And so I have been inspired and grateful to learn from that work, but also to see what could we be doing to hold people accountable and develop guidelines. So we developed, say, this within CPATH, we developed some research ethics guidelines that took us about 5 years to do because we tried to be really collaborative. They go out of date quickly. I think that's one problem with it, which is why I've been advocating for more, actual sort of community ethics committees or groups that could, have a say, share their perspectives. Because I think the other thing that happens that's very troubling is sometimes there'll be, the group, whether it's a funder or these research ethics boards will know maybe one trans or non-binary person, and all of a sudden that person is being asked to represent, our communities, which are obviously extremely diverse, and we have a lot we disagree too, right? Like there's lots of divergence. So how do we actually have accountability, both getting researchers to be accountable, but also us as researchers and the people that would sit on these kind of committees? How are we going to be accountable to our broader, like extremely diverse trans and non-binary audiences, publics, communities, right? Like we have a lot to answer for. Kind of like I see it sort of from at least two angles. So, okay, I'll stop there. Sorry for the no notice. Yeah. My colleagues are much better at saying, and now I'm coming to my final point. So sorry about that, Charlotte.
Stats, did you want to go? Okay. So I think, yes, so thank you, Zach, for all of that. And I want to, in part, sort of remind, especially the audience who may not be aware, that the institutional review boards or the research ethics boards also exist differently, not just between the United States and Canada, but sometimes even within the United States, from state to state. And largely those review boards, whatever they're ultimately called, are about legal indemnity for the university setting. And so if the university is going to get sued, like that's it. Like that's their major. And I'm not trying to belittle that, but I think it's worth saying that's their in the United States context. Like we're anchoring ourselves on things like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks, like really super fucked up ways research has happened, and being like, so we got to avoid that. But then it's more of a, okay, can we get sued? And especially in the United States, very legalistic in this way, that like we don't want to get sued, or if we get sued, we know what's happening. So, I wanted to state that I think that a board like that may have some usefulness, but I'm not hopeful that in the United States we're going to get there anytime soon, because in the US we're at least too focused on suing each other. So I think one of the things that we can do in terms of this accountability to pivot is to really create the structures within different scholarly disciplines that allow us as researchers or scholars of whatever kind to really make sure that we focus scholars who generate work on the standards by which they should generate it. So it's a concrete example, because I'm trying to talk about a lot of stuff, but in psychological science, we, like as editors, could basically be like, you have to have a positionality statement. Like in addition to the quality of the work, like who are you? Like, and how did you have access to this community? And that may not necessarily get published as such, but if there's a screening process that goes through, then I think that goes some good way to have it at least, and kind of to do the work, but to offload the work onto people who are, quite frankly, are being compensated for it. But for those of you who don't know, and kind of in the audience and elsewhere, like it's not like we get paid lots of money, but we do get paid, a nominal amount of money to actually do editing, not reviewing, unfortunately, in the United States, but at least editing. And so it's something that an editor structurally could focus on. You could have editorial teams that do that. And so that way, even if the scholarship is like, I want to write about trans people in some philosophical way, what are your bona fides about that? and another way to do that is think about what's your agenda, like, and make that explicit. Because if we as editors putting stuff out there, we're kind of one of the gatekeepers to scholarly work going out. So we need to take that more seriously. And it's an impingement on academic freedom if someone wants to take it that way. Because, you know, journals have all sorts of goofy rules that are ultimately arbitrary. So you can't, and they're like sandboxes. Like, you can only play in my sandbox if you bring these toys. Fine. So why not have this toy, you know, sort of so-called, but in a good way? Like, why not have this be part of what is happening? Like, if you want to come here and play in this sandbox, the way we play in this sandbox is we are accountable to the communities that we are trying to characterize. And that's how this sandbox works. And that preserves all kinds of academic freedom, but I think it also allows us to do work that is compensated, and that it creates now a culture within scholarship where that becomes an expectation. And for those of you who know about it, I think that this is a parallel idea to what's happening with these ideas of open science. You know, a lot of us were doing open science without it having a framework and a website and all of that before that happened. But as soon as people started to realize, hey, this is a thing that we need to focus on, which it is truly. Sure, there were some missteps, and, you know, there's the open science bros and like bad behavior that happens even within that context. But enough good behavior happens out of it that we start to also see early career researchers understanding this is a structure, this is part of the bounds now that I have to do my work within. And if I think if we create those kinds of structures in a minute way, then it starts to then filter out in at least the scholarly publications some of those more dubious pieces of work. Because they really can only find themselves in a dubious publication. And so long as then we're all like, those are the dubious ones, then the field moves. But also I have a cute phrase that I've used for many years, which is box out the bigots. And so how we box them out is not to cite them, but also not to let them get into serious scholarship. And so we have to avoid those reviewers and editors who are about contrarianism and who just want to sell their journal or whatever. Like, those kind of people need to be incentivized out of the system. And in that way, we can start to have this more, which I think it needs to be a more protracted conversation. But if there's a structure in place for how the conversation is going to work, then I think that's going to be a win, and that's a start for us to be able to do that.
I love that idea. And I was thinking of the same thing as you were talking along. I was like, oh, just like the guidelines we have for open science these days in the field of psychology. I think when I was thinking about this question, I was even thinking about pushing it like a step earlier than like the journal side, which is like when we're talking to back to the participants and thinking about things from their perspective. I think at least in psychology, anyone who's done like psych research knows that we have to do informed consent. But I think a lot of people, at least in psychology that I know, and I'm also, guilty of this, is sometimes we just think of it as like a box to check. And so we write this page of information that actually is meaningless. And that like, if someone read it, they wouldn't really know what our research is about. They wouldn't know anything about who we are. They wouldn't know really much substantive information about the funding. And I think we can do better. And I've seen some people in some spaces publish statements along with their invitation to do research that just like openly lists all of that information. So like, and then people can choose. And I think that's another thing that to make it, most research that I do says like you can drop out anytime and not receive any penalty or anything, but I don't know actually how free people feel to drop out or not. I know when I'm taking a study, I don't feel free to drop out, and I do research. So but essentially empowering people to like feel like, oh, you don't actually have to answer all these questions, like make everything optional. Like, what can we do at the methodological level to, when we're designing our studies, when we're extracting data from these communities, how can we make participants feel more empowered to share what they want to share and not, feel compelled to go along with what we're asking just because we're researchers. Another thing that I think that I've seen in other subfields of psychology is having very open and explicit conversations about exactly what's going to happen at each step of the research process, and like, what is the community going to get out of it? What is the researcher going to get out of it? Who owns the data? Who's paying who is getting paid? And these can, obviously it takes time to have that kind of a conversation, to put that kind of like document together. But especially if you're going back to the same community, I think it can be worth it to be explicit about these things up front, have it on paper, have people, sign documents. And like, I don't know, even if you can like sketch out various possible alternatives depending on how the results come out, or if something unexpected comes up, how are you going to handle it? It's like kind of like conversations that groups of scientists have about authorship. People are like, oh yeah, do it early and often. I feel like this falls into that bucket of topic.
Amazing. This has been wonderful. So I'm gonna stop with my like prepared long-winded questions and shift to our audience Q&A. So while I get these sort of cued, feel free, lovely panelists, to do your little water chug, take a deep breath, take a second while I make sure that I can pose these live. And again, I think I saw a couple folks maybe trying to pose questions in the chat. If you can move those into the Q&A, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, we're probably going to miss them. So here we go. This first one is from Aiden. And if there's another part of this that we missed or whatever, feel free to chime into the chat as well. But I'll just read aloud. It says, this may be less relevant to the work that y'all do, but as a qualitative researcher, I wrestle with when to share manuscripts or publications with my informants, many of whom are quite excited and have specifically asked to see the published work. I'm sure we've all been there doing qual work. At what point in the process do you or would you send a manuscript out to informants? Would you approach this differently for an article than for a book? As well as thanks for the amazing conversation so far. And a little clarification point, I'm thinking specifically about before versus after peer review, if that makes a difference. I know, I want to say all three of y'all have done both qual and quant, but I might pose this one to Zack first, just because he and I have collaborated on qual work, and I really like the way that you think about this type of thing. So I'd love for you to take a stab at it.
Ooh. Thank you, Avery. I think, okay. Sometimes I think, Aiden, there's this piece too about what is ideal and what is possible, depending on how community-based the project it is. Because sometimes we're like, oh yes, and we want to send it out to all the participants and get feedback. And then you're like, 2 years after and you have no money and everyone is doing it, off the complete side of everything else. I know Avery can relate to that one with the project we were on. So I think, ideally, I think it would be awesome if we can get feedback before we submit it for publication and share it. And I guess it depends partly maybe on sample size and if people have agreed to that in advance. I know in a project we did recently and something completely different, we asked focus group participants if they would like to be involved in the knowledge mobilization process, and 100% of the people said yes, which was, I found, super moving. So I guess it's just knowing, do people want to be involved, to our participants? What are we asking? Kind of like negotiating that part of it, I think is really key. But I think it can definitely help too with the accountability, because I don't know about you, but I think I've had a situation where I've gone and read, a manuscript and wondered, oh, like, why that part? Why did they include that quote, or those pieces? Maybe just to take a slight step back though, I'm really trying to think differently about the idea of data, because especially in qualitative work, I find this is really our histories in our communities, and I feel it really belongs to our communities. So I've been trying to think differently about And definitely, Viviane Namaste has done this for years, but just thinking about it, is it possible that we consider this as more of like an oral history archive? Where does the information go? Because, after, if we have these rules according to our ethics boards, that if we have to like destroy things after 7 years or 5 years, or it doesn't sit well. I'm like, wow, why? Could this be, what is going to happen to this? So I guess that's another thing for me. And I don't know, Aiden, if how that relates to your work, but I wonder about it more as a community owned, and then, the participants to be part of the decision making about what happens with this. And sometimes I know, say with Viviane's work, it's been embargoed. Some of the interviews that she did were in the oral history archives, I believe at Concordia, but they're embargoed for 25 years, but then they will be kind of returned and accessible to people as part of our histories. So that's just another piece for me that I have been reflecting on a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I don't do any qual work. I respect it, but I don't do it.
I love that idea of like a community resource. I'm interested in like doing more qual work. I currently have 0 qual pieces published, but it's something that I'm interested in, a direction I hope to grow my research in. I just want to this is very random, but I want to shout out, I've been a participant in many qualitative projects. And one of my favorite strategies that a group took around a study that I was involved in as a participant was, I think the second one hasn't happened, but they're checked in with us twice. So after all the interviews were done, they essentially summarized each interview and sent it out to us to make sure that their summaries, their take homes, the things they took away from my interview reflected what I actually wanted to say. And then I think what they're doing now is they're taking those summaries and using it as a baseline to form whatever it is that they're going to form. And then I actually don't know if it's before peer review or after peer review, but they're going to send it out to us again in article form. So I kind of liked seeing, as a participant, seeing what they took away from our conversation and then what they turned it into. And I just thought that was a very pithy kind of maybe not easy, but relatively accessible first step.
That's so awesome. I also just wanted to add one clarification. In terms of people being interviewed and as part of these potential archives or histories, it obviously needs to be with consent, around that. So I just was wait, I just wanted to clarify. I wasn't oh, now everyone's interviews are just going to be available to the public. No. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I also conceptualize of qual versus quant maybe a little differently. So I'm to my mind, there are some things that end up being quantified that are qualitative processes. So forgive me if I misunderstood and thought that some of what y'all do also counts as qual. But either way, thank you for the question, Aiden, and thanks for thinking through it, synchronously, which is always a little tough, especially after we've already had such an involved conversation for an hour and a half. So I'll go to the next one. We may not have time for everything. So I'm gonna try to prioritize really meaty ones, which also may just look like the ones that I think are especially interesting, but I'll save the others as well in hopes that that can be future conversations. So the next that I'll pull is from Kai. And Kai says, in a trans research project I'm involved in recently, we were trying to decide whether it was better for a knowledge translation product to release as little data as possible in order to reduce the risk of being taken out of context, or if it was better to release more data that better contextualizes and nuances the data, and thereby indicates how we think the data should be interpreted. This varies a lot depending on the topic and the data. No shit. like varies quite a bit. But I would love to hear panelists' thoughts on this. And I'm really curious, especially to see y'all's perspectives on this from coming from such different, but maybe adjacent fields.
Yeah, I mean, the question is a little abstract, but I try to sort of concretize part of what I could hear from the question. And if the anticipation of the question is like how people could misuse the data, then I think that's an important consideration. And what I found useful, professionally, is to basically kind of create another step of data access for the people who are interested. So now we have, in psychology at least, we have the open science framework. So you can post things there and you have to just register. You don't have to pay for it. But it's that extra step of someone having to kind of go in there and get it versus just kind of posting it on your personal website or something like that. And I think that extra step piece of data access is so allow the data to be, accessed in kind of all of their glory, but make it so that people have to do that. And what you get is interested folks who will do that. The kind of trolls, to use the modern phrase, or the people who want to, to sow disinformation, they're largely not going to go to an extra step. But if you kind of make it super public, then they can just be like, look, I don't understand anything. So I'll take one misunderstanding and jam it with another misunderstanding. And look, you can go see it too. And unfortunately, you would think that they're caught in their giant misunderstanding, but then they're not. So I think so one possible way is just to create one more level of data access. And that also doesn't just have to be like you have to use open science framework, for example, but you can also just like, email me as the author, and then you get to have, you get to sort of have a conversation with that person and kind of vet what the interest in sharing the data set would be. And if they can't answer it to your satisfaction, well, then you don't have to provide that information to them. So that, I think, it gives us just a little bit more agency, and and makes it that the interested folks can try to access it. And I say that also with understanding that there's nuance with, if you're a senior researcher as a PhD or something like that, people trying to contact you, hierarchy, all of that. But I think even that consideration notwithstanding, I think it's better to try to create a second, two sort of layer access, so that you can help control how data are disseminated. So that's just my thought about it.
I think I might sound a little bit like a broken record because I know I said something very similar before, but I guess my first consideration would be like, what is the risk to releasing more data for the people who provided that data? And that would be my primary consideration. Like, what kinds of data? I was frantically Googling knowledge translation product as Charlotte was speaking, because I wasn't sure what that meant. And I was trying to figure out like, oh, maybe it's a particular kind of data, and I wasn't able to find anything on time. So yeah, consider what kind of data you have about a person. Consider what kind of risk what kind of risk there is to releasing that information out in the public. And I think that's at least where I would start. Yeah.
I think it also very much depends, as you said, on the context of it. If you're in a really community-based project, the people that you're partnered with will know sort of like what their goals are, right? And may decide, you know what I mean? Oh, we want to use it this way, or we're really not comfortable with this framing of it. And if there's anything that I would say that I've experienced in relation to qualitative research, is just that the lens that you're bringing to the analysis can take it in, a number of different types of directions. So that's one thing I think about, is just for us to keep sort of front and center. What are we doing it for? You know what I mean? Because my other challenge though is that we don't have a lot of control over things, right? Once they do kind of go out into the sort of more public sphere. So I think when it comes to things like reviews, I've just tended to want to be ultra transparent about all of it, about what's included and what was our process and what was our inclusion exclusion, and how did we get to this point, and how did we involve communities, and did we have an advisory, just to be like definitely as transparent as possible, partly because for me that helps to improve the accountability mechanisms. But yeah, I feel like this is maybe one of my late night worry kind of questions that I don't have a lot of answers to, because I'm like, oh yeah, we don't have a lot of control over it. So maybe it's also being proactive. Like, I'm like, can you say, I guess we can't say, don't use it this way, or this cannot be interpreted to mean the following. Like, I don't know, because I don't do as much quantitative work, but I'm curious, are we allowed to say those things?
Yeah,
I don't know.
But Zach, I think you definitely are, and that's an opportunity that especially us in the quantitative sciences don't actually do our good job of. Like, we have a limitations section where we're like, here's all the things that we can't say, but but we can also have the strength section, which is here's all the things that people should not say because they're not true, and they would be antithetical to what actually happened. So part of that is is a little bit, unfortunately, it's behavior that we as quant researchers have access to. There are no sort of blockades of any or barriers of any kind for us to do it, but we're just not trained to one of Seth's points, to anticipate that and then say it, or we self-censor. We think, oh, we can't say that, but no, you can't. Like, especially with certain geometric models that you've applied to data, they exclude other possibilities, period. Like that is what they're designed to do. And some are still in play, but we could just do a better job of saying that in our own publications, but also especially if we want to translate that. Like, when we talk to science writers, when we talk to other media outlets, we should have not only our talking points of what we found and what we can say, but also what we cannot and should not say, because we have evidence against that.
That feels very exciting to me. I would love to see that, actually. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah. Thank you again for this question, Kai. One other thing I want to add as like a reflection on what y'all are saying is I really appreciate too this like confluence of concern over the role of the researcher, the position of the researcher in shaping the research, even in quantitative work, where there is this sort of impetus to say, we're a removed objective observer. I'm sure a lot of us have read, Donna Haraway and the idea of the view from nowhere, and you have to have this God complex of like, only I can see from the vantage point of the heavens, like what's going on the ground, and synthesize and summarize that for you, dear reader. And it's like, actually, there wouldn't be a need for publication if we could just endlessly create models without, a theoretical impetus or without a researcher whose interest or investment in a question shaped why that study was constructed the way that it was. So I really appreciate that y'all are all thinking really carefully and clearly together, in conversation about like, we assume qualitative research is shaped by the researcher, but y'all are also pushing to say like quantitative is absolutely being shaped by the researcher as well. And that's really refreshing, because I'm sure y'all have run into this as well, where sometimes in the quantitative end of our fields, like they're like, no, but if it were, then we wouldn't be doing quantitative work. We'd be doing the me search, whatever it is. So that's really, really encouraging to hear. So then I think we probably have time for one more. There's three. Oh gosh. Okay. One has a response. It's about demographic stuff. I was just at Population Association of America, Laura. So feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to discuss, because I just got to organize some panels on really innovative methods for SOGI measurement. So happy to chat separately. To that end, I might dismiss your question. I feel so bad doing it, but for sake of time.
But Avery, can I just add just a very specific thing? I think what we also always want to think about with that kind of question is, what are you actually going to do with those data? And that's the point, because I think too much, because gender means at least 5 different things, you can't measure them all easily in one place, and nor often do you want to measure all of them at any time. Like you may only be interested in some information, and that includes the gender demographic questions. And I see a behavior of people trying to collapse presentation into their demographic. Like, what are you trying to do? Always think about like, do I need a certain level of detail, or all I'm going to do is just, you know, organize categories sort of that are like this many of these groups, which in that case, it doesn't have to be so intensive. And that's not bad. That's just, as a quantitative researcher, you have to understand what are you actually trying to do and what do you need to accomplish that goal. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I saw one of the papers I got to curate for a session was on deconstructing gender quantitatively from secondary data, specifically about this, like trying to quantify to some degree like contextual outness, or when one discloses one's identity, versus perceptions of visibility versus perceptions of how your presentation versus your identity align or misalign. And there's so much there that's so nuanced that I think is really interesting and fun to play with quantitatively, because we think maybe that's the hardest place to do it. So yeah, I think we could have a whole nother big ideas panel about methods for measurement, all the various aspects of gender. And I can see that Charlotte especially likes the question from Freya. So I'll make sure that before we end, I save these others, you know, for future conversations, but I'll pose Freya's as our last one before we wrap up. And it says, I really appreciate what Charlotte mentioned about the importance of stating positionality, and I would love to hear your thoughts about how this might be navigated when we want and or need to maintain privacy for safety reasons. And of course, Zack Stats, you're welcome to jump in as well.
Well, thank you for the question. I think part of that can be done as well confidentially in the process, like with the editors. There's always a place that you can confidentially communicate with your associate editor or your editor about anything, really, including like people that you don't want to review your paper. So I think, you know, I'm being, you know, very purposeful in this. I think, Freya, like this is a place where if people, because of their university, they're, you know, existing in a state or a country where they can't actually be out safely or easily, then if a positionality statement is something that you want to do, you can make it confidentially, and you can make it in a confidential context. And editors have lots of different ethical responsibilities. Most of them take it seriously, you know, so that's just, you can't, you know, again, a human behavior, but that can be something that's a part of the process that you can share confidentially. And then depending on what the journals are, it may be assumed that, you know, papers that get published have that kind of statement somewhere. And if it's missing kind of here, it's implied that someone else vetted it. So that is my kind of short answer to that question. But I thought it was one that I think a lot of people don't know, especially if they're professional academics, that there's lots of ways that you can share information confidentially.
I'm going to quickly jump in, and I hope I'm not stating something that is obvious to Freya, but I was recently in a room with a couple of qualitative people discussing this very question. And at least in psychology, we often do research in groups. So creating a group positionality statement can be a useful way to both disclose one's relationship, like whether you're an in-group member or an out-group member, but without naming who's who. So if you have like 3 people, you could be like, some of these people identify as racial minorities, and some of these people identify as racial majorities, and similarly to whatever dimension it is that is relevant to what you want to include in that statement.
I feel like in addition to the researcher positionality, which I know is becoming a very contested area of conversation in some places, I just want to know more about how was the community involved? Our communities brought, you know what I mean? What does that look like? Where did this come from? You know, where did this idea come from? I'm almost more interested in that, to be honest, at the moment, because yes, you could have someone who's, you know, trans or non-binary leading it, but it doesn't mean it's, you know what I mean? It doesn't mean, okay, then everything's fine, great, perfect. You know, so I think I want the next layer too. I would love to see that.
Yeah, I mean, just to put a point on that end with Zack, there are a lot of, you know, specifically white trans male apologists for psychology, like, and who are just kind of like, like it's fun, you know, I'm trans, and they sort of use it in this manner to be like, it's okay if I then engage in bad behavior, you know, oh, I'm trans. And so, but as I wanted to name those identities because it often is white privilege, male privilege that they're deploying. And then also then trying to hide behind the fact that like, oh, but I have this one minoritized identity. And I think exactly right. We need to make sure that positionality itself isn't the only thing. Like you can't just say part of these groups, therefore okay, because sometimes it is, and most of the time it is, and that's great. But you know, we know sometimes it's not. And I appreciate your point about we need that extra layer.
Excellent. So we still had a couple questions left that I made sure to pull. So maybe in the future we'll have time to discuss these. So I apologize to Molly and Elena that we've run out of time. But to sort of wrap us up, I want to remind folks, you would have seen this when you were registering, that a recent piece in our journal that we run through the Center for Applied Trans Studies called Bulletin of Applied Trans Studies, yes, we're always about the animal acronyms, was co-authored, but I believe with Zack as lead author. I don't know how you conceptualize that. I know we've had lots of conversations about that ourselves. A really fantastic piece on trans research ethics. It really served as the impetus for us organizing this panel. So do check it out if you want to see a longer written form, especially of Zack and his co-authors' thoughts on the topic. And yes, there will be plenty of other opportunities for us to continue this conversation in various ways. So I want to thank everybody for attending. I especially want to thank Charlotte and Stats and Zack for participating. And Ari and TJ for doing the logistical labor. Even while TJ's out of the country, they still were like frantically making sure we could all access the panel. So our director is never far away in the wings, sort of making sure we get things done. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Is there any like last things that anybody wants to add, or are we happy to just say, cool, we did it in 2 hours?
Just thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, to the panel and to Avery and everyone for all the work and labor, and for everyone that was here and the amazing questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's spaces like these that, you know, not only, you know, do we need, but we're going to continue to need. And so, you know, I just appreciate everybody taking the time, you know, to participate at any level. And even if we didn't get to, you know, answer your questions, you know, at least you can email me if you have questions for me. And so I won't speak for the other two speakers, but that's, you know, I want to continue these conversations and make sure that the momentum doesn't stop with, you know, yay, we did it here. And like the work is ongoing. You know, we still need to nap and do all that, but you know,
Definitely.
You know, and party in the streets, but, you know, also do the work. So.
Definitely just echoing the Charlotte, Zack, Avery, thank you so much for having me. This was a really wonderful, inspiring conversation to take part in. Similar to Charlotte, I'm happy to be contacted afterward. I'll drop my Twitter or something in the chat. Feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. So.
Lovely. Well, thank you again. Do check out Zack's article. Absolutely check out Charlotte and Stats's work as well. And again, super, super grateful for the conversation. And we've managed to record it, thankfully, so we'll be uploading it in the future to the CAT's YouTubes for us to enjoy, you know, for however long the internet stays around. Thanks again.